Welcome back to another Sunday video here. Q&A this week. First question. Wes asks, intra-set stretching? Question mark. Well, actually, this isn't really what he asked. He saw a video of where I was doing lat pullovers and he was like, hey man, you seem to stretch yourself out during your in-between reps on those. What's kind of going on there? Are you doing that for hypertrophy reasons? Are you doing that because you think it's good for hypertrophy? My hair looks fantastic. And shout out to my client, Donna. I just want to give her a shout out because I know she watches these, and yeah, nothing to do with intraset stretching though. But anyways, I struggle to think that intraset stretching is really going to be all that much better than just kind of regular training. And I say this because I feel like the mechanism for why intraset stretching would work would be because it just adds more tension to the muscle and you get a little bit more overload. So for a more advanced trainee, how much are they actually going to be getting out of doing some intraset stretching? I would say probably not that much. Now, with that said, I listened to a podcast yesterday with Andy Galpin, and he's muscle fiber dude. He's incredibly smart, knows what he's talking about. And he was talking about how we are just starting to understand how hypertrophy even works. So to say that we know the best methods for hypertrophy and stuff like that is probably a little far out there. And I would say that if you've never done intraset stretching before, hey, maybe you try a little bit of stretching under load and that sort of thing to get a really nice stretch. Maybe it does have beneficial effects. I think Dr. Jose Antonio in birds have noticed some pretty good hypertrophy, but I just said it was in birds, so that's about all I have to say about that. But I think that in total for intraset stretching, I struggle seeing it really adding to just normal traditional training, especially for more trained lifters. And I think that the mechanism for action for why intraset stretching would work would probably be because of just more mechanical tension and overload on the muscle. But then again, I feel like that stretching a muscle under load might not have a very good stimulus to fatigue ratio, because I'm not sure if it really would add much more of a stimulus compared to regular training, but stretching a muscle under load is pretty damaging, and that might just add more fatigue than it actually is stimulus. Now, one could also argue that, hey, maybe just a variation in training stress and maybe some sort of stretching every now and then, periodizing that into your macro cycle, maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea, just to kind of hedge your bets and have it in there. So I don't necessarily think that you're gonna lose out if you don't do any kind of stretching under load and stuff like that. But I could see someone make the argument for just hedging your bets and doing a bit of intraset stretching here and there throughout your macro cycle. The second question here comes from Sven, and he asks, what do I think about doing a refeed while going through gaining phase? And kind of mentioned that, hey, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling fatigued, I feel like I could use a little bit more food, and what do you think about using a refeed while gaining? And I think that it's important to consider what the purpose of a refeed is typically for. And that is typically for the purposes of dissipating a little diet fatigue, maybe having a little bit of decrease in psychological fatigue while you're dieting. And the purpose of a refeed, kind of in my opinion, is to kind of help reverse some negative adaptations to dieting and maybe make dieting a little bit more efficient and maybe a little bit more of an easier process. But if you're not dieting, I don't really see the rationale for a refeed. And I would more so adjust your calories while gaining based on your rates of gain. And I would shoot for about 1% of your body weight gain per month. And if you're gaining at that rate, I probably wouldn't mess around with doing a classic refeed. So what do I think's going on here, Sven? Well, you also mentioned that you haven't deloaded for like 2 years and you're feeling fatigued and tired and that sort of thing. Well, there you go, Sven. I don't think it's because you haven't done a refeed. I think it's just because you haven't deloaded in 2 years. So, my bad. Take a deload. You'll be all right. People retain all their muscle mass pretty much without training for like 2 to 3 weeks with no training. So, if you do a deload every couple of years, which I would prefer to see it every 4 to 8 weeks, I think that you'll find that your fatigue drops and you're a lot better off there, all right? So I don't really see the rationale for a refeed while going through a gaining phase here, Sven. But you mentioned you haven't deloaded in a couple of years. You're fatigued. I think your answer is in your question there. And take that deload, my man. And my next question comes from Victor, and he asks, hopefully you guys don't mind me doing this in my car here. I've still paid attention to the road. Don't worry. I don't recommend this. And be safe, my friends. But Victor asks, what do I think about, and some of these questions, I kind of changed the question, so this might not be exactly what you asked, Victor, but I changed it around so it made sense in my head at least. So volume when in a surplus compared to a cut. What do I think there? Great question. And I think that volume during a cut, I like to keep at more moderate levels without a whole lot of accumulation of volume. And in a surplus, I will be much more aggressive with accumulating volume. So here's kind of exactly what this might look like. During a surplus, I might work from 10 to 20 sets per muscle group or per the muscle groups that I want to prioritize. And during a cutting phase, I might just hang around like 12 to 15 sets, somewhere in there. Sometimes I decide to accumulate from 12 to 15 across the mesocycle, but sometimes I keep things pretty level throughout. And the reason I do this is because when you're going through a gaining phase, you probably have a little bit more recovery resources. You probably are eating a little bit more food, so you just have a little bit better recovery. Maybe you're sleeping better. Maybe your overall stress levels are a little bit lower. Maybe you can recover from a little bit more. And since you are eating more food and you're generally in a more anabolic state, you might be able to grow muscle from less volume than when you're kind of going through a cutting phase or you're in a more catabolic state. So that's why I think during the gaining phase, you can kind of get away, quote unquote, with starting with a little bit lower volumes because you're more anabolic anyways, so you can grow from a little bit less volume. And then when you accumulate volume, you can accumulate a little more volume and be okay because you have a little bit more recovery resources with the more food and stuff like that. And then when you're in a dieting phase, you might be a little bit more catabolic, but you also don't have as many recovery resources with the food. So that window between your MRV and MEV is a little bit tighter. So for those reasons, I think that it makes sense to kind of hang out at a volume range that's kind of more moderate rather than accumulating volume. So a good rule of thumb that I like is, hey, if you notice in your gaining phases, 10 to 20 sets works pretty well for you, then maybe during a cutting phase, just hang around like 13, 14 sets, and you're probably gonna very much so keep all of your muscle. You're probably pretty safe with that, and you won't run into over fatiguing yourself a little bit too early on, all right? All done with my training session there, but the next question comes from Matthew. And I sent out an email to the Revive Stronger email list and was basically like, while dieting, one way that you can potentially increase your kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio, and this isn't necessarily while dieting, and this is kind of what the question gets at, is by performing your isolation lifts before your compounds. And the idea behind this is that your isolation lifts almost allow you to kind of pre-fatigue your muscle a little bit, so you don't have to use as much weight on the compounds, which might beat up your joints a little bit more and might just be a little bit more taxing. For example, you might perform your leg extensions and hamstring curls before you go to do a squat. And this might allow you to get plenty of effective stimulus in on your squats with a little bit less weight, which might just subjectively feel a little bit better because you don't have as much load on your back, you don't get as much axial loading. So that might be a way to kind of improve your stimulus to fatigue ratio. And what Matthew said here was like, okay, now what if I did this all the time? What if I did it in a surplus and stuff like that? You know, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. The reason I suggest it for a deficit was because usually fatigue's a little bit higher. So improving your stimulus to fatigue ratio might be beneficial there. And I just had to stop and wave at a dude. But if you're going through a surplus, would it still be beneficial? Yeah, I could still see an argument for it. However, I probably wouldn't do it all the time. And I still think that there might be something to doing your compounds first so you can really track your progression with compounds, because compounds are a little bit more conducive to progression because usually you can use more weight, so you can add weight to the bar with it being a smaller percentage of your total weight. So for example, if you're getting stronger on a leg extension, you might only be able to leg extend 100 pounds. So adding one stack to that, or 10, 15 pounds, is still a pretty big increase compared to just adding 5 pounds to a 300 pound squat. So you might be able to kind of micro load compound lifts a little bit easier. And since you can load them a little bit better and you can progressively load them, I think that performing them first and being able to really track that, because if you always perform them after isolations, it might be a little bit more difficult, except you might argue that, hey, if you still perform them after the same amount of sets of isolation lifts and all that sort of thing, that if you're progressing on those, you can still see good results. I think that there can be a case that can be made for that, but I do think that there might just be something to performing those compounds first when you aren't under a lot of fatigue, and you can come in there and just kind of crush that top set and progressively load that and track that over time. So I probably wouldn't, as with everything, I think a balanced approach would probably be pretty good here. So I wouldn't always do isolations before compounds, but I wouldn't always be opposed to doing some compounds after isolations. And hey, maybe if you train a muscle group 3 times a week, maybe 2 of those days you do your compounds first, and maybe one day you will do isolations first. If you train it twice, same thing. One day you can do compounds, other day isolations, and just see if you like it. I think that we really get caught into the thinking that we always have to do compounds first and stuff like that, and I think that's great. I don't think that you should do your compounds when you're under a ton of fatigue and your systemic fatigue is so high to where you can't keep good form and that sort of thing. But I don't think like a couple of sets of leg extensions before some back squats is really going to affect that a whole lot, and it might be able to even help you get your knees nice and warmed up, and there's probably less warm-up time for the isolation lifts, so you might even save some time warming up, but that's probably pretty insignificant and small. But yeah, I think that I wouldn't get too carried away with it, but I do think that performing your isolations before your compounds at least every once in a while isn't a bad idea. And Dodo Gree asks, their squat has been stuck for a few months here, but all their other lifts are good and are going well. What's kind of going on here? And my first question would be, what does your diet look like? Are you going through a gaining phase? Have you gained any weight over these last few months? Kind of what's going on there? If you are in a gaining phase and you're gaining at a decent rate and all your other lifts are improving and it's just your squat that seems to be stuck, I would probably do one of two things here. So one thing you could do is just add a little bit of variation in there. Maybe instead of squatting first right off the bat right away for a mesocycle, you put your squats after your deadlifts, or you change up your exercise order of your squats, you change up your rep range, you add in some sort of variation for your squats, and you leave it for a mesocycle, and then you come back to it first and see how it feels then. That variation might be enough to have a little bit different of a stimulus, and when you come back to it nice and fresh, you can see some progress. Additionally, there's people that fall in the camp of, hey, if a lift has plateaued and you're feeling plenty recovered from that lift and things are going pretty well, one thing you might do is add a little bit of volume for that specific lift. So it would be adding a little bit of specific stress for that lift. So if you're just squatting once a week for 3 sets, well, then maybe you start squatting twice a week for a total of 5 sets per week. Or if you're already squatting for 6 sets per week, twice a week, and you're feeling good, maybe you add a set to each one of those, and that might be a little bit more specific stress that helps your squat. Now, this sounds like kind of like two different things. One approach would be to add a little bit of variation, and one would be to just do a little bit of more of that specific stress. When do you decide which one to do? I would say if you're already doing like a pretty good amount of squatting, so if you're squatting a couple of times a week for like 6 to 8 plus sets already, I would probably go the variation route. But if you are only squatting like once a week or for only 3 or 4 sets a week, I would probably go okay, let's increase the amount of times I'm actually squatting a week, or increase that volume a little bit, all right? So hope that helps. And my next question here is a common kind of client question I get, and that is kind of how to handle social events. And for social events, I think that it probably depends on where you're at with your training cycle and with all that sort of thing. So if you are going through a dieting phase or a contest prep, you might handle it a little bit differently than you would handle it if you're in a gaining phase or maintaining. For example, I have a client, Peter, my man. He is kind of right now, well, we're about to hop into contest prep, so that's exciting. But right now, or this past mesocycle, he was kind of just maintaining, focusing on his social events a little bit, and sorry, dog hair in my mouth. And during that time, we really focused on increasing flexibility and not worrying about things a whole lot. So in these periods, we handled social events of, hey, let's not eat like an asshole. Let's still be okay. Let's still try to make pretty good decisions. So like if we're drinking alcohol, we aren't drinking a ton of drinks that are like really sugary and stuff like that. And we're not always hammering a pizza and stuff like that after we drink. And if we go out for lunch for a social occasion or whatever it might be, we might choose a higher protein food and a sandwich or something like that, and not go crazy with things, and just kind of guesstimate things and really not worry about it. And I think that the approach of, okay, I'm just going to kind of guesstimate. I'm going to choose foods that aren't like super calorie dense, so even if I'm off, it's not a big deal. I think that approach is probably what I recommend for most social events, just because it can keep you from what I've done multiple times in the past, and being at the dinner table with your family that you see like 3 times a year, and you're thinking about your macros, you're calculating them in your head, and you're thinking about, you're even plugging your food and playing like Tetris and MyFitnessPal, moving stuff around and spending way too much time on that when you're seeing your family like 2 or 3 times a year, and there's probably better things to spend your time doing, and it made me not really enjoy a lot of those social events and just cause stress. But now when I take the approach of, okay, earlier in the day, I'm just gonna eat some protein, I'm gonna fill up on veggies, I'm not gonna like starve myself into the event, because that can go even worse, but I'm gonna get some protein in, get some veggies in, go in there, not totally crazy hungry, but I'm still gonna try to just not worry about my calories. I'm not gonna plug things into my fitness pal, and I'm just gonna make decent choices there and not eat like an asshole. I think that is a really good approach. Now, if you are dieting and you're into contest prep or something like that, it also depends on how close you are. If you're like 4 weeks out, you might have to actually like guesstimate and track and put stuff into MyFitnessPal. But most of the time, I think that you could plan for a refeed or a higher day, or maybe it's you plan to have your deload and diet break that week or something like that. I think that you can plan around it to where you can take the approach of, hey, earlier in the day, I'm gonna have more protein, more veggies, fill up on that. And then when I go into it, I'm gonna try to pick a little bit better options, but I'm not gonna worry about it too much and still focus on kind of enjoying my time and stuff like that. So that is it for this Q&A. I think I'm gonna do these monthly, so I don't know, shoot me a question sometime and I'll answer on this thing, but I appreciate you watching. And shout out to all my other clients that watch this. If I shout a single client out, I feel bad that I'm not shouting everybody out. So shout out to everybody, and shout out to you for watching this. Even if you're not my client, you're awesome, and have a good rest of your day. Bye. That was such an awkward sign off. I'm sorry.